It's great to have back on the program today Dean Baker, who's a senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research and also a visiting professor at the University of Utah. Dean, we spoke about a year ago, most recently, and we now have a very different situation from the standpoint of the pandemic. Economically, what are you most paying attention to, and what is of concern at this point?
Well, the economy is recovering rapidly, and that's a very good story. I mean, we still have a lot of people out of work. We're still not back to what we might consider normal, certainly far from full employment. But to my view, the question is the rate at which we're going and the extent to which we see obstacles. One of the big things, or the big thing, of course, is the pandemic itself. I mean, we have the numbers way, way down primarily because of the vaccines, which have been great. But we know there's a lot of people who don't want to take them. And as a result of that, they're getting sick. So that's a bad story. Now, as it stands, I don't think there's a big economic problem with that. I mean, I don't want to trivialize people getting sick and dying. That's a big deal. But I mean, if we're just talking about the economic impact, I think that's relatively limited. The big concern, and this should be a huge warning to us, we of course are talking about the Delta variant, and the vaccines are still effective from that. But as long as the pandemic is spreading out of control, not here, I mean, obviously we care about here too, but around the world, we're not going to be safe. And that's a really, really big deal. So I wish we still now do more to get the world vaccinated. So that's a really, really big story. But the other part, just how do things look in the economy right now? Well, we've had fantastic job growth the last 4 months, over 600,000 a month. We'll get a GDP report next week, and the second quarter's almost certainly going to put us above where we were in pre-pandemic. I mean, we have a ways to go yet to be back on trend, but most things are looking pretty good. And so, as the economy goes, I'm feeling pretty good about it. We just have to make sure we could slow the growth of the pandemic, partly here, but probably more importantly right now around the world.
There's been this refrain or talking point, call it what you will, in the context of this enhanced unemployment benefit that the federal government established during the pandemic, that now as things are opening, there's a worker shortage. Businesses are having trouble finding people to work because people, quote, would rather sit at home and collect their enhanced unemployment. Now, we have some early data from some states that decided to get ahead of Joe Biden's September date and just cut the enhanced unemployment early. It's not totally clear that it's really having a definitive impact, actually, on the rate at which people are starting to look for jobs or being hired. Generally speaking, my view is most people want to work, and most people find, for better or worse, they find meaning and identity through work. And that could be a bad thing or a good thing. We could talk about that. But that the kind of free rider, the people who just would prefer to sit at home and not work, are so small in number that they're not significant. What's your sense of that talking point?
Yeah, well, everyone's got their lazy cousin who's sitting at home collecting benefits, and they extrapolate to the whole world. I'm not sure
Yeah.
how many lazy cousins out there actually exist. But in any case, everyone could say they know someone, and some people surely are. But there's been a lot of research on this. I mean, remember, we had $600 a week supplements back in the original CARES Act.
Right.
And there were a number of efforts to study the impact of that. And they found it was very little. It wasn't zero. I mean, obviously, there's some people that will make a difference for. But there was relatively little impact. And you mentioned that now you have several states that have jumped the gun, or whatever term you want to use. They've ended the benefits early. And my friend Aaron Dubé at the University of Massachusetts, he analyzed what the performance has been in the states that have ended benefits early compared to other states. And there's no difference. In fact, I think there's a very, very small uptick. I mean, I'm not going to blame it on that, but I think they actually had somewhat higher unemployment or rise in unemployment relative to other states. So the idea that that's a major factor in keeping people from looking for work, I just don't buy it. What I do think is going on is you have a lot of businesses reopening at the same time. I mean, the biggest story, of course, is restaurants. That's the one that was hardest hit.
Right.
And now they're reopening. So they're looking to all hire a lot of workers at the same time. And it shouldn't be surprising that that's not that easy, that they're in a situation they can't get the workers they need. They're bidding up wages. I mean, that's a good thing in my view. But in any case, that's really not a terribly surprising story, nor necessarily a bad story. And in any case, it doesn't seem as though the unemployment supplements are a big part of the picture.
Is it as simple as some others are saying, which is, well, it's just now the businesses, the employers need to compete for the apparently temporarily limited pool of potential workers, and this should just mean that they pay more and then it'll solve everybody's problem? Like, is it that simple?
It is. I think that's basically a story. And some businesses say that, well, I can't afford to pay higher wages. And I'm sure in some cases that's true. And, look, this is a capitalist economy. And, some businesses go out of business all the time. I mean, I trivialize that. I mean, I know people put a lot of work, in many cases, their life savings, so I don't mean to trivialize that, but that is the reality. So in some cases, we'll have situations where businesses just aren't going to be profitable. And I understand they don't want to say, well, if I get away with paying workers 10 an hour rather than 15, things, but sorry, that's going to be the world. And so I just don't see this as the big crisis that it's being portrayed as.
On the other side of this is pricing and inflation. During the pandemic, we saw really significant increases in some products. Lumber was a big one that had some sort of follow-on effects in terms of building of new construction homes, renovations, etc. The price of lumber has now actually dropped precipitously, although that drop does not yet seem to have filtered through as much as it maybe will to the end products that the lumber is used for. Some of the inflation data that we see compared, for example, May 21 to May 20. So you're sort of comparing to when there was a significant demand collapse, and maybe that's not the right way to look at it. What's your perspective on this issue of inflation?
Well, I think for the most part, it's reasonably well under control. So again, the May to May comparison, or now we're in June to June, but I mean, that's, it's kind of silly because it's, these are months where prices were badly depressed. So if you look at what inflation's done since February, the last pre-pandemic month, it's up some. There's no doubt about it. But an overwhelmingly large share of that is simply cars, both new and used cars. And we know what the story is there. There was a fire in a semiconductor factory in Japan, and that's led to a worldwide shortage of semiconductors, which has limited the production of new cars. And what that's mean is people have money now from the various pandemic programs. They want to buy a car. New cars, they can't get new cars, so they buy a used car. And used car prices have just gone through the roof. They've actually begun to fall by some measures as of June. So we'll see how that pans out over the rest of the year. But that's the bulk of the uptick in inflation. So it's hard to get too concerned about that. My expectation is that we're going to see those prices falling through the rest of the year. I mean, they'll still be higher than a 220 level, but they're going to be falling from where they were in June. So I'm not that concerned about that. Other areas, the New York Times had a big piece on housing. House prices, sale prices have risen a lot, and that's because a lot of people are moving. That we have very low mortgage interest rates, and you have a lot of people that are moving from expensive places like New York, Washington, where I came from, and they're moving to cheaper places around the country and putting up big upward pressure on prices there. New York and some of the more expensive ones, price growth is slow, and in some cases actually gone negative. But that's a big story. Now, whether that leads to sustained increases in rents, I think it's a little too early to tell. I was struck, this isn't necessarily a good story, but if we're trying to tell the picture of the housing market, we have to consider we're ending the eviction moratorium ends at the end of this month. And their reports, I think these are exaggerated, that somewhere around 7 or 8 million people face eviction. Now, I don't think anything like that will actually be evicted, but a lot of people will be. And again, I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying if we're looking at the housing market, and let's say we have 800,000 people evicted, I'm pulling that somewhat out of the air, but it will be a lot. That's a lot of vacant units. So it's, again, I don't mean to say any of this is good. That isn't. But we have a lot of turmoil in the economy right now, which has led to inflation in some areas. I was mentioning cars. I could identify some others. But it's not an underlying, it's not the sort of inflation we saw in the 70s, where you had higher wages driving higher prices, leading workers to push for higher wages. And then we got the spiraling upward. We're very, very far from that story.
You mentioned in the car discussion that now part of this is people have money to spend and they want cars as they get back to things. One of the interesting things that we saw, so to kind of set this up, pre-pandemic, frequently we would see articles with headlines like 40% of Americans would need to borrow to meet an unexpected $400 expense. And about the point of those stories was very low savings rate in the United States. During the pandemic, we saw headlines about dramatically higher savings rate in the United States. At a macroeconomic level, how should we think about that? Because there's a school of thought that keeping money in bank accounts instead of spending it has a very low economic multiplier and is not so good for the economy. Although at the individual level, certainly we can understand how having an emergency fund is a very good thing for a household budget. So how should we be thinking about that?
Well, there's two issues here. One is if we're thinking of just immediate demand in the economy, that does restrain demand. So if I have, I got my $1,200 or $1,400 check from President Biden, and go, okay, well, I'm going to put it in the bank because I don't need to spend it right now. Well, if we're worried about inflation, that's actually a good thing. So if we're worried there's going to be too much demand in the economy, that's a good thing. So I think as that has worked out, it's basically been a positive for the economy in the sense that as we're having this reopening and there's a lot of stress in different areas, it probably is a good thing that everyone isn't rushing out and spending it. Now, say 6 months, a year down the road, as you say, the flip side, the micro side is, okay, I've got money in the bank. I feel better. And we know, I mean, there's a lot of data. People's balance sheets are better than they've been in decades.
Right.
So things really look much better. So that's great both in their security, but also maybe they want to do a big ticket purchase. Maybe they're going to use that money as a down payment on a house or a car, whatever it might be. So I consider that overwhelmingly a positive that, again, if we were worried, oh, we need more demand in the economy right now, then people saving is definitely a bad thing. But we're not in that situation, or at least I don't believe we're in that situation. So I'm very happy to see that a lot of people are in a situation where they could save some of their money. And again, they could always keep it there as a reserve, or they may decide 6 months, a year down the road to have a big ticket purchase.
Two other, I don't know if we would call them trends or things that have kind of been topics of conversation as a result of the pandemic. One is work from home and the different decisions that are being taken by decisions being made by corporations about we will do permanent possible work from home, or we will do a split of work from home and be back in the office, et cetera. That's one trend. The other one is we're also getting more and more information from these 4-day-a-week work trials, which sometimes are a full 40 hours, but over 4 days. And sometimes they're actually fewer hours, like a 36 or 37-hour week over 4 days, and looking at what employee productivity is over that period of time rather than 40 or 45 hours. What's your thought on these things at sort of this point in time, but also bigger picture?
I think they're both very encouraging trends, taking one at a time.
Yeah.
The work from home, clearly, we're going to see way, way more work from home than we did pre-pandemic. I mean, the point is, business inertia is an incredibly powerful force in the economy. People have to appreciate that. For a long time as an economist, I go, oh, maybe it should be like this rather than that. And you go, well, maybe it should be, but it's not going to be. Well,
right.
Once employers got used to having people working from home and they kept their business operating, then they can't say it doesn't work. They know it works. So we are going to see many more situations where either people are totally working from home or cases where maybe they come in once, twice a week from the office. And I think that's a great thing from a number of different perspectives. Obviously, it saves enormous amount of resources on commuting.
Right.
People's time. I mean, obviously, people value their time. And if you're commuting 2 hours a day, 1 hour each way, that you're wasting a lot of time. I don't know anyone. I mean, there's a lot of things we could argue. How much do you like this or that? I don't know anyone likes their commute, and I'm sure someone somewhere does. But I
think just to interject one idea there are some studies about if you have a 15-minute commute, that it seems sort of for a lot of people to be a positive kind of change of phase from home to work, and that once you get longer than that, the duration of it seems to start having like a more of a net negative effect.
Yeah, I could believe that. I mean, a short enough commute I can grant isn't a big deal.
Yeah.
I used to walk to work. I was lucky enough for a period of time to be able to walk to work. It was maybe half mile. So,
yeah,
rough, 10 minutes or so. So, yeah, that was fine. That didn't bother me. Unfortunately, I think the vast majority of commuters have considerably more time. So,
yeah.
So I think that's a great thing. And I think it's good, of course, from an environmental perspective, where people don't have, obviously, a lot of resources are wasted in commuting. So that's a great story. 4-day work week, I think similar story. Again, if you compare the U.S. to Europe, there have been sharp reductions in work hours over the last 4 decades in I was going to say most all European countries. And we now, our average work year in the United States, 25% longer than it is in Germany and Netherlands, Denmark, other wealthy countries. And I think most people do value their time. And if we could have a 4-day work week rather than a five, that's great. And yeah, I'd love to see the hours cut because I think a 10-hour day, certainly in a lot of jobs, people would find exhausting. So if we can make it a 9-hour day, maybe somewhere down the road, make it an 8-hour day, but whatever. 9 hours isn't that much worse than eight. So, I think most people would consider that a pretty good deal. And again, getting back to the commuting, if you have 4 commutes rather than five, that's a plus. So I'd love to see us get to shorter work years, and a 4-day work week's a really good way to go.
Without a doubt, I'm with you there, Dean. We've been speaking with Dean Baker, who's a senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, also a visiting professor at the University of Utah. Always great having you on.
Well, thanks for having me on. Good questions.